Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening for the webinar, Black People Adopt To, the History of Black Adoption in Canada. My name is Catherine, and I am the Community Engagement Liaison for Adopt for Life, a not-for-profit charitable organization that provides peer support, community, education, advocacy, and awareness to adoption, permanency, kinship, and customary care communities in Ontario, while honoring the first lived experience of adoptees and first families. We want this webinar to be engaging, so whether you are watching with us live now or perhaps on replay, please feel free to comment, discuss, share your thoughts, and ask questions. There will be a specific time at the end of this webinar for Q&A. We will do your best to answer everyone, but please know that if we are unable to answer during this live, please email us at info@adoptforlife.com and someone will make sure to get back to you. We do want to make sure that you are aware that this webinar is shared across our public platforms, meaning that your comments and questions are going to be publicly available. So we just ask that you remain mindful when sharing information, including anything personal or around the identity of minors. Now, before I formally introduce our presenter for the evening, I would like to take pause and acknowledge the lands that we are situated on today. I am aware that we are probably coming from all different parts of Ontario and beyond, but I personally reside in the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Ojibwe, and the Mississauga of the Credits people within Treaty 19. Now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations, and as a first step towards improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. To recognize and acknowledge the historic and ongoing devastating effects of colonialism and racism in the name of assimilation across Canada, and to consider how we each, in our own way, can action forward in a spirit of truth, reconciliation, and collaboration. I now have the absolute pleasure of introducing to you all Elise. Elise is the Accessibility, Racial Equality, Diversity, and Inclusion Coordinator at Adopt for Life, otherwise known as the AREDI Coordinator. I usually slip up trying to introduce you, so I'm really excited that I got your title right. Elise is a proud mixed race Black queer woman raising 6 children with her wife in Ottawa area. Their 3 younger children were adopted through the child welfare system. To be the parent that her children needed, she had to educate herself in trauma in all of its form and manifestations, including FASD, attachment, neurodiversity, among other essential things. She also quickly realized that some of the challenges were common in families created the same way as hers, while others were specific to minority and marginalized communities, such as the BIPOC or the LGBTQS+. Using her MA in political sciences and her diverse background, she intentionally applies an interdisciplinary and an intersectional lens to address complex realities to create change. Diversity is at the heart of her identity and her work. So Elise, I want to thank you so much for being here. I am so very excited. I know this webinar had a really great response. So we are looking forward to learning and growing. And for all of you who are watching, please feel free to comment and share. Hit the like button to show Elise some love because we really appreciate it. So thank you so much, Elise. I'm going to turn my camera off, but for all of you who are watching, myself as well as our communications and marketing director, we're in the background. So if there is any concerns or issues or technology stuff come up, please feel free to post that in the comments. But Elise, please feel free to take it away.
Thank you, Catherine. I think I share your excitement, honestly. It's going to be a very interesting webinar, a very personal one for me, but also hopefully very interesting one for all of you. Thank you for joining us tonight. It is a very special day. I think it might be the perfect day to do that presentation because we are It's Family Day, so we're celebrating families, and what better way to celebrate families than to learn about a new way to make a family and a different way of seeing family from a different perspective, for sure. When I thought about this presentation, I thought I would just I'm going to take you on a journey. I'm going to take you on the same journey that I took while I was trying to figure out to understand what family meant for me as a biracial person. I am of Caribbean descent, so my family is from the Caribbean, and so also of African descent, but the other part of my family is from European descent. So it was interesting. So I will tell you more in about a minute. That webinar is entitled like We Adopt Too. We Adopt Too is actually comes from a website, an organization, and a movement that started in the US. And it's about teaching and sharing and growing the Black community through adoption. By reminding people that we adopt too, for sure, maybe not in the same way, for reasons that you will learn about during that webinar. So let's go. The history of Black adoption in Canada through my own eyes. So, like I said, first I'm going to take you on a journey with me. So I will tell you a little bit about my family, my own family, and why I had so many questions about family and especially about adoption. But you will see that I wasn't calling it adoption at the time. Then I will bring you a little closer to my African heritage and why some of the answers that I had were answered through knowing a bit more and learning a bit more about my heritage and my ancestry. And that is the part that I share with many different people who share African descent lineage. But what I didn't have in common with people in Canada is that I'm an immigrant, and I had to learn a lot about the history of Canada and what it meant to be a Black family in Canada. And I learned a lot about different things. And adoption is a great way to go through that journey to learn more about Black families. And then we'll chat about what did we learn about adoption, Black adoption in Canada? What can we keep from what we've shared tonight? And what can we do to learn more or to do more or to do things differently? Before I start the presentation and before I go into more depths about what I was talking about, I want to just give a little warning to people of African descent. That presentation can be difficult to hear at times. So if you feel like you need to take a break, you can always watch the recording later when you feel maybe more at ease or more comfortable to continue. I know that some of the things that I'm going to share, when I learn about it the first time, when I hear about those things the first time, it was really difficult for me. So please extend the same grace to yourself if that's what you need. So let's start. So like I said, I'm biracial. My mom is from the Caribbean. I also have part of my family that is in Israel. You will see why. You'll see it's interesting. And the other part of my family is from white European descent. So I grew up with very different cultures and very different way of seeing family. For my dad, it was a very simple lineage, very simple family structure. There was my dad, of course he had siblings. Those names are not my family names, either way, they're just random. But at the top, there was my dad. My dad had two parents. Those two parents had two parents, et cetera, et cetera. I can build my family tree on my that side very easily by just following the names and the dates, et cetera, et cetera. And weirdly, you could think that's very simple. It wasn't for me. Why? Because I was closer to the side of my mom's side's family. And family for my mom looks very different. It looks a little bit like this. Not exactly, but a little. Like there's link everywhere. The tree is not linear. There's just a lot of connections. Some of it are obvious, some aren't. sometimes you know about, sometimes you learn about. It looks complicated. But for me, I was born into that family that felt very easy. What was hard for me with my dad's family side, what looks simple to you, what hard for me is that they were very strict about what we can call the Western family culture, which is centered around the nuclear family. And when you have a nuclear family, that means the heart and the center of the family is two parents and children. But then you have the extended family. So you have first cousin, second cousin, and third cousin, and great aunt and great uncle. And for me, it was always a math problem. I had to figure out, okay, who's that person? If I take my dad, who's that person for my dad? So what are they exactly? Are they first, second? It was always a mental gymnastic for me because it wasn't something that I was born in or I was close to. What made sense to me is that family tree, a little messy, but very easy. Why? Because there was no first, second, or third cousin on my mom's side. There were just cousins. And there were no great aunts, like second remove or whatever. There was uncle and aunties, there were great aunt and great uncles. And that was it. So actually, very easy to follow for me. This is a representation that goes in a little bit into more depth about what I felt adoption was when I was a child. So I have this big family tree on my mom's side. But if you go closer, I'm going to show you two examples of what I grew up with and what adoption looked like for me. Again, not my family names, but still. So take a look at Mysteria. Mysteria is actually my aunt. She's the little one on my mom's side. She's the last child. And it was a sibling group of 5. So when she was born, my grandfather, you will see him as icon on the tree, decided that my aunt should live with his sister, Lois. And Lois was married to Clark. And so my aunt, my biological aunt, was born to my grandfather and my grandmother, but was raised by my great aunt and my great uncle. That great uncle was a Bulgarian Jew who lived in Israel. He met my great aunt when she was in France, and when they were both in France, because it's a spoiler alert, but I consider him my grandfather. So my great uncle was a diplomat, and he came to France, and my great aunt, who lived in the Caribbean, came to work at a bank, and they met, and the rest is history. So now my aunt Mysteria, who, if you followed, was born to my grandfather and my grandmother, but was raised by my great uncle and my great aunt, she now lives in Israel. And so that's why I have Jewish heritage and I have Jewish family. So that's an interesting way of doing family. But what's even more interesting is that my grandmother, Nubia, on the family tree, was also born to my great-great-grandfather and my great-great-grandmother, but was raised by her uncle and her aunts. And that's something that repeats in my family tree. That's what adoption looked like in my family. And that's why I knew what it was. The first thing that I could remember from my family was adoption was part of us. It was part of the community. It was part of how we do family. And we didn't even have to talk about it. Actually, we didn't really call it adoption at all. The only time that I realized it was adoption, it's when I was outside of my community and I was trying to talk about my family, which was very easy for me, very simple. But when I saw other people's face, I understood that it was not simple for them. It was actually very complicated. And so I had to find the right term for people to understand. And I came across adoption. And then from that point, I told everybody that my aunt Mysteria was adopted, which never really felt right, but that was the only way I could describe it. So I went with it. But still, I always had that question: why does my family from on my mom's side looks like this, and it's so easy for me to understand, but it's so different on my dad's side, and it's really hard for me to understand. And I really, really wanted to not learn more, and I really wanted to know more. And so I did the right thing and I educated myself and I went and searched, okay, what's the difference? And it led me to my African roots for two different reasons. And I'm going to go into details in a minute. But I had to realize, okay, it has something is different, because where I come from in the Caribbean, it's called Guadeloupe. And it's actually a French territory. So it's considered France. But how can we be so different if it's France? And when you were born in Europe, on the European side of France, you see family one way, and the other side you see family different way. And obviously it came to African roots. Why? Because ancient African culture saw family very differently from the Western typical nuclear family structure. And when I learned about how the differences and the distinction between the Western and the African model, I recognized what I felt deep inside, what family was for me. And it really spoke to my soul. And what I learned is that in ancient African family structure, nuclear and extended family, it's a fluent concept, which exactly what I told you. It means that it doesn't really, nuclear family is not a thing. Community is a thing. Like it takes a village is a thing. And nuclear and extended are blending together. There is no separation. So that's why in African cultures and in my Caribbean culture, we do not have first, second, and third cousin. It does not make sense. We have a family and we can describe that family. Sometimes we even have more than one father. We have more than one mother. I've always been very open to the fact that every woman that raised me or helped raise me is a part of my mother lineage, and it could be my mother. I consider my aunt Mysteria, who lives in Israel, my mom, my little mom, and so I'm very close to her. So that is a very fluid concept. Another thing that I found very interesting and different from my dad's side and my mom's side is that from my dad's side, ancestors and really people that came before us were just a moment in time. Like they were pictures, they were names, they were just like roles. They were just like frozen in time and just remembered as one thing. But on my mom's side, it wasn't so much about pictures. It was more about history and events and what happened and who married who and what it means for the community. And it had that sense of ancestors and people from the community, and people will be part of community. It's more of a flowing idea, and it's more of a cycle idea. Like everything is always in motion and everything is always interconnected. And so I am who I am because of who they were and their history. And that is a flowing concept that keeps on living and living. And that's why having children and growing the community and growing the family is so important, because it's part of a cycle that keeps continuing. And for us, is also a story about survival, which we're going to talk about in a second. Also, marriage is a cultural event. It wasn't so much about religion or social structure or even like family ties. Like I remember a union, and when people talk about marriage, it was really more of the community celebrating, a new door is opening, a new cycle. Like the fire is going to be fueled, the cycle is going to be continued, and it's something that involves everybody. It impacts everybody, not just the couple that comes together. It impacts all of us. And I had this great feeling, and I remember it vividly that this is what it was. But I also grew up with a lot of people that come from different African countries. When I say Africa, I will never mean that we are one solid block or there's no diversity. I'm very aware that there's a huge diversity, and actually refer to Africa as the right like space. So I will say West Africa, East Africa, North Africa. I'm very respectful, but we do share this. We do have this in common about family structure, and it's found everywhere across the continent. And so I found out that part of why family on my mom's side made so much sense to me is that it comes from that heritage. It comes from this ancestry. And this is part of what makes us people of African descent. We do share this. We do have this in common. And we do have this cultural, social, and historical continuity that started there and we brought with us. We brought with us from where? Of course, we have to talk about the other side of it, which is the heritage of slavery. I don't want to go into too much depth about slavery. I think that's not the subject tonight, but it does impact family and family structures a lot, especially for people like descendants of enslaved people. Family was a very complicated thing throughout slavery for reasons that I can share here. People were property. You could be sold, you could be bought, you could be exchanged, you could be traded, you could be, anything could happen because you were property. And so your life was very unstable. And therefore family structure was unstable, but also family ties were almost impossible. Separation was a common thing and a constant worry. It was a source of pain and very disturbing situation. You can only imagine having to have a child under like horrible conditions, having to see that child grow up and maybe one day be sold the next day. So it was always on the community mind that something could happen. And that's why community and family became a concept that was more social and a social connection. Blood was always important. I think it comes from our ancient African origins. I think blood was always a very important part, and we kept that with us. But we knew we couldn't keep this as a center of the family. And so community became something important. Solidarity, the fact that the elders were raising the younger ones was important. And one interesting aspect of all of this, because the impact on family structure is obvious, it's really hard. But I thought it would be interesting to talk about marriage, because marriage as a symbol it came from that ancestry, from that African descent origin, but we made it what it needed to be. Of course, enslaved people couldn't get married, not legally, but they still wanted to be married and they still wanted to have families. And so they had to do it very discreetly. Being very open could be dangerous. Showing emotions or close connections could also threat the stability of the community and your family if you were able to have one. Some families were regular families, they were able to stay together, but it was never a given, and it was always something that wasn't stable. But sometimes marriage was used against enslaved people. Some owners thought that by encouraging marriage and encouraging some of their enslaved people to form connections will keep them from running away. And that's the interesting dynamic with creating a family. It could play in your favor or it could play against you, but it was always something that was in the balance when it comes to your life and your life decision. Also, one of the reasons abolition and abolitionists denounce slavery as being inhuman is also because it was tearing family apart, and it wasn't and parents or fathers were not able to keep their children, and it was really a traumatizing event and a traumatizing moment in a family life. So it was also used as an argument and a reason why slavery should be ended. So family is really also at the heart of this, and throughout survival was part of what was important for enslaved people. And so family and the way they made family and those social connections was important, and it remained an integral part of how we do family for sure. Like I said, like this is an example of an ad. Once slavery was abolished, some people still wanted to find their family. Like I said, blood was still important. It didn't really change anything. It's just to survive and to make life bearable, enslaved people had to realize and to accept that that's going to be difficult to maintain. But once slavery was abolished, some people placed ads in some newspaper and try and find their family and try when they knew where they were sold or they had heard of what happened to them. And so this is one of these ads. And if you want to go on the internet, there's more ads that you can see to get a little closer and a better idea of what it was and what it meant. So this is kind of where we arrive at adoption, because you might have thought, okay, it was the history of Black adoption in Canada. But that's on my side, what adoption means. Everything that I told you leads to exactly this. People of African descent, they don't really talk about adoption. It's not really a word because informal adoption are integral part of family structure. We don't need to talk about it because it's one way of forming community. And why really separate things or make a big deal of something, because it's just how things are. And it's sometimes, and I talk to this about this with friends and family, sometimes we just learn that someone wasn't born to this family and they were just raised, and it's really random through a conversation. I think I learned about my grandmother being raised by her aunt maybe when I was 15, because I was like, I remember seeing that picture of that man that looked like my grandmother's twin that I've never seen before. And I'm like, who's that person? And she was like, oh, that's my brother. I'm like, no, I've seen your brother. That's not him. It's like, no, it's my biological brother. I grew up with this family, but it was my aunt family. And I was like, what? And so it was interesting. So the first thing that I want you to live with is that we adopt, but we adopt through informal arrangements. And so Black adoption can be described as a lack of papers, not purpose. Because really the huge and major difference between adoption, as you know it probably, and how we do adoption is that it's not seen as a negative thing. So it happens all the time because parents don't have to feel bad about it. It's a good thing. It's a part of keeping a vibrant community. It's a part of continuing the cycle. And that is why adoption is definitely something we do a lot. That's why I have in common with all people of African descent. This is what adoption means to us when we need to put a term on it, because like I said, adoption, not the best term, but that's the common understanding, we can use that. But not what I learned about adoption in Canada from a Canadian perspective through Canadian history is also interesting. You will see that I was a little disappointed, rightfully so, because the history of Canada, and as I knew Canada, and as it is, don't get me wrong, is a country where you can find freedom. It's a country where you can find opportunities. This is a country where you can find open-mindedness. And this is a country where Black people have been since settlers arrived in Canada, really. There is a very ancient African-Canadian community, but also part of that community, that Black community came because of the Underground Railroad, or were enslaved people that run away from slavery. And they did find a safe haven in Canada. But they didn't find a country that was free from racism or discrimination. And so it did impact the history of Black adoption in Canada. And that history of Black adoption in Canada cannot be separated from the history of the child welfare system, obviously. Most adoptions of Black children are done through the child welfare system. Of course, there's international adoption that do happen, and that's kind of a separate conversation, but that's also a very loaded conversation. But when it comes to the child welfare system, very early on, its creation, it was created in the late 90s. And from its very own creation, it was already something that was born and built on white supremacy. So really already Black people were targeted and seen as unworthy or lesser or just less than human already. And so you can imagine that that child welfare system was what it is now. It's a majority of white middle-class women working at protecting children, which we need for sure. But when you look at a community specifically a little too hard, you will find things that you won't see in other community that might happen anyway. So creation of the child welfare system was problematic from the start. And early in mid 20s, when we talk about adoption and the child welfare system, it was mostly unmarried women who were seen, who were actually, no, their child were taken from them and were adopted by family. And that's part of the Canadian history when it comes to adoption. But the child welfare system at the same time was already segregating Black children from white children, and white children were seen as worthy of having a good family and a good home, when Black children were not treated the same way. They were segregated in the child welfare system, but let's remember also that they were segregated in school, they were segregated in cities, they were segregated in jobs. Like I said, enslaved people find a safe haven in Canada. They were safe from slavery, but not from discrimination. In the 40s, in archive, we found that some papers described Black children as children with Negroid blood as were deemed unadoptable. So if you were a Black child that was taken from its family and placed somewhere, because you will see, and we will describe a little, you weren't placed at that time. You weren't placed in foster care or with a foster family. You were placed in institutions, because really Black children were not seen as a good fit for a family. So they were placed in institution, and where they were left to die or to stay until they were able to just live on their own. And you can imagine how hard it was. But they couldn't be adopted. At that time, in the 40s, adoption was not a thing. It was, and it was not sanctioned by the state, and you couldn't do it unless you were involved in an informal adoption. So you'll see where I'm going. In the 50s, CAS placed children with Negroid appearances in institutions. So every children that were Black and considered to be of Negroid appearance were placed in this institution. And when I say institution, you can imagine exactly what it sounds. There were places where there was a lack of everything, proper place to sleep, proper food, care. Kids were mistreated. They were abused. They were left to die. Yes, and I'm sure it reminds you something. So those institutions were really heartless institutions that was really there to just keep Black children somewhere, but not somewhere safe, and not somewhere that was going anywhere, actually. Something that I want to mention is between 1955 and 1967, a lot of children were removed from their home because they were children of house worker that came through a program that's now infamously called West Indian Domestic Scheme, where workers from the West Indies were brought to Canada under the full pretense that they will get good jobs and they will have good life conditions and better opportunities, which was not true, because they were here and they were treated like modern slaves. And what happened is that those parents were those mothers, because it was mostly mothers that were able to bring their child to Canada, were seen as, again, unfit, unreliable, uncaring, and just not equipped to be mothers. And so a lot of children were removed from their home. And of course, since adoption was not not popular, but adoption was not really an option for Black children, those children were also placed in institution rather than left in their community, in their home. And the most heartbreaking, I think, part for me is that first learning about the fact that Black children were left in institution without any chance of having a family. That part really stayed with me and kind of broke my heart, because I do have 6 children and they're all Black and 3 of them are adopted. And I could not imagine my kids placed in an institution and able to have a loving family, the loving family that they have now. But also when I heard about the fact that Black mothers were over surveilled and considered and not, they couldn't care for their children, it really struck a core, because Black women, like it said in that quote, Black women have historically been tasked with the role of taking care of white children at the expense of their own families. Yet Black motherhood has been historically widely denigrated. And that alienation, that information, that cognitive dissonance in my brain was just vibrating. I couldn't believe this is exactly what I felt in my heart and my soul. It is so unfair, because Black women have been expected to care for children, and yet they're not seen as good mothers, which I can relate to. Then there's a turning point, not a good one. In the 60s, actually, this is when transracial adoption became more socially accepted. It was seen as almost positive. Why? Because that's a society called the Open Door Society. It was a liberal, self-described liberal society that decided that transracial adoption was a good thing because Black children could be saved. But saved from what? They could be saved from their Blackness, because being Black was not something that was desired. Being Black was not seen as something positive. And those children, by being adopted by a white family, could become good citizens and decent human beings, which is a huge turning point. Let's remember that before, Black children were considered to be undesirable, which means that they weren't seen as worthy. You couldn't do nothing with them. They were Black children. What are you going to do with them? But in the 60s, things change because of that society that's actually advertised the good side of Black adoption, transracial adoption of Black children, of course. And so at the time, the paradigm shift, because now adoption was a good thing. It became something that was seen as positive for Black children. There was a new door that was open for them. There was new possibilities, but not for them to remain connected to their roots, their heritage, and to be proud of who they were. They were adopted to be changed and to be different, into something different. And so that's why the National Association of Black Social Workers was created first and really advocated against Black adoption, transracial adoption of Black children, because they saw it as what it was, which was a form of cultural genocide. Because there's nothing wrong with being Black, and that's what advertising transracial adoption was all about. Let's save the children from who they are and what they're going to become by being Black. So yeah, a turning point, like I said, not necessarily a good one. In the 70s, the trend continued with CAS. Black population, Black communities were over surveilled. There were, of course, more children apprehended, and the system keep growing, and the numbers became higher and higher. And this is when the Huru movement started to advocate for a separate system. And it has been a demand from Black communities since the 70s that a Black child welfare system should be created, and Black people should be in charge of that structure to make sure that those situations don't continue, and so things can be changed, and so something could be done with the trend that was continuing and getting worse and worse of the child welfare system taking Black children away from their family, and at first being placed in institution, but then adopted by white families, where of course they lost the sense of themselves. Unfortunately, that child welfare system was never created. It was never an idea that was accepted or taken seriously, and so it never happened. But in the 80s and the 90s, there was a crisis of over-representation. Like I said, since nothing was done, Black children were still taken away from their home. And with the little education about community, about the importance of staying connected to your community, like lots and lots and lots of Black children lost their connection to their community. And there's nothing worse than growing up without a family, but also without a sense of self, and without an idea of who you are and what are your values and why do you feel the way that you feel. Like I said, I knew what family was for me. And especially when I learned about my African descent and the way they saw family, I could recognize myself and I could connect on a deeper level. And I can imagine how it feels when you might be a child that is of African descent, but you can really trace your lineage, because if you are a descendant of enslaved people, it can be difficult to know where you come from. I know where I come from because one of my great aunts made a family tree and was able to trace part of her family to a specific country in Africa. But a lot of people that are descendant of enslaved people, we're not sure where it come from. So it's a double punishment to not have a sense of who you are, where you're connecting, where your roots are, to have an idea of, I come from somewhere, my tradition, my culture, the way I do things, my values come from something that I cannot really understand, and I'm not sure where it comes from, but I know it's there. But then being removed from your family that you've known and having that double disconnection, it's soul crushing. And during the 80s and the 90s, this is a generation of people, of Black people, that was raised that way. There's a lot of similarity with the 60s scoop, of course. I'm sure you heard it, and I'm sure you understood it. That is, there's a lot of parallels between Indigenous communities and Black communities and the way they were treated. But yeah, I didn't say it, but in the 90s, of course, the numbers were just so high and through the roof that it was just absurd, and it became urgent, and funding and initiative and approaches were developed to try and stop that hemorrhaging of Black children. Because clearly, when in Black youth in care, there's a rate of 400% compared to the general population. This is not even a crisis. This is a cultural genocide. Like, it plays, the data show it, and it plays in front of your eyes. So like I said, there's a lot of similarities between Indigenous and Black communities. The only difference, and that's why adoption is an interesting concept when it comes to learning about history and looking through that lens, is because adoption was always used almost from the start by the colonizer as a weapon of mass destruction, a weapon of general a cultural genocide, of ethnocide. It was really used to destroy Indigenous cultures and communities. For Black communities, it started differently, because Black children, like we saw, were considered undesirable and not adoptable. So once again, you can see the heritage of slavery, where Black children are dehumanized. They're not seen as people or worthy as becoming people, of being saved, or soul that could be saved. It took years into the 60s for people to see Black children as worth saving and worth like soul that were worthy of attention. Before that, has a continuity of slavery. they weren't considered humans. And the legacy lives on in the 2000s, of course. The most recent report that was published by One Vision White Voice and the University of Toronto, it was actually released last year, 2022. And it analyzes data and tries to understand why Black children are overrepresented in the child welfare system. And so they went into numbers, and what they found is that, yes, there's an overrepresentation, but Black parents are not more likely to be abusive, they aren't more likely to be violent, they are not more likely to be neglectful, they are not more likely to be different than other parents. And the explanation of the overrepresentation was quite simple, actually. Systemic racism, heritage of years and years and years of discrimination, segregation. It just plays what it was meant to be. The system was designed from the get-go. We saw it was designed and built on white supremacy, and it's still doing the same job that it was supposed to do. Some people would advocate for different solutions. I don't have the right answer. We're just here to learn about the history and the reality. I'm happy to start a conversation for sure. So why adoption matters? Why I was so interested? Because first, it helped me know who I was, for sure, and understand why I felt so different, but at the same time, so connected. Adoption was also interesting for me through Canadian history, because it showed how Black people were perceived. And it really helped me understand on a deep level what it meant to be a Black family in Canada. Before and now, of course. Adoption is an ancient practice. Like I said, it's not a negative one, it's a positive one. It's part of making a family and a community being vibrant and be like alive, like the cycle keeps growing and going. It also showed me why Black lives matter, but also why Black lives didn't matter in some, like in Canada, in Canadian history. And adoption was one way to realize that. How come Black children were deemed unadoptable and undesirable? Let us think about what it means. It meant that Black children were not worthy. They were not human. They were not seen as people. And that happened in Canada. That was a really tough history lesson for me, for sure. But do Black lives matter now if we keep on letting that system tearing family apart? If we let that system, again, create people without roots, create people that have their heart completely disconnected from their community and from their sense of self. I will let that sink in. And what it means, adoption is a very, it's a really deep questioning about self-identity. For having adoptive children, I know there's always that question, where I come from, why was I adopted, who I am, etc. And the fact that Black children could be left without roots is something that stays with me, and this is something that I work on, and that's why I'm passionate about the work that I do, to make sure that we can keep connection where it's needed. We can keep roots, we can build roots where they're missing, and we can actually change life by giving children what they need. And they do need a sense of who they are, and they do need to have roots. And if we have to regrow those roots, we can do that, and by working together. And adoption is also a way, and it's sometimes I think adoption has a very positive connotation. Like, it's like, oh, you're adopted, you were lucky. But for like a biological family, it's full of pain, and it's full of it's real of heartache, because really adoption right now, it's rarely consensual when it's about a public adoption. And this is what it's hard for me to understand as someone of African descent. It's hard for me to understand that adoption can be used in a negative way. Adoption can be used, for example, to destroy a community, to destroy a culture. It could be weaponized. And that is very traumatizing from someone like me who saw adoption as a very positive thing. It could be a weapon of oppression. And that definitely stayed with me. So I hope you see why I think adoption is a very interesting subject when it comes to history, because it teaches us a lot about what our values are, where we come from, how we do family, how we are seeing community, and why it takes a village to raise children, but how adoption can be used also in a different way in a different social context. So it's almost on a philosophical level. We can think about family. Okay, what is family for me? Is it for you? Is it the nuclear family? Is it easy when you saw my dad's family tree? Do you see? That makes sense. It's super easy. When I was, that's a little difficult. It takes a little math for me. Or did you recognize yourself in my mom's family tree when connections are everywhere and nowhere and told and not told? That's an interesting conversation we could start. But I think we need to constantly remind ourselves that we need to find ways to see things from different perspectives, and we need to be understanding and accepting of different realities. And that is also it's always very interesting and very important. So what now? Like we saw, the most recent report about child welfare system shows that there's progress, but systemic oppression and systemic racism is still something that's part of Black community everyday life. It's also and still a possibility that you could be targeted for the color of your skin. Because the only reason why Black children are overrepresented is that's what racism is just seeing someone for their skin color and not for who they are. And that is unfortunately still in Canada. Black people are still more likely to get arrested or to have an encounter with the police. They are still more likely to not access proper care, especially when it's not culturally responsive, culturally sensitive. And they're still more likely to live in precarity, depending on when you arrive in Canada. But it's still very much a possibility. That means that just the color of your skin can determine a lot of what's happening with you in your life. And when it comes to family and adoption, it's the same thing. But also, we can stay positive, and we can see some numbers are showing that things are changing. There's a lot more investment that is done, especially within the child welfare system, to try and change things. That report will be used to put in place new approaches, systemic training, and there's also a lot more and more advocacy that is available for Black parents when they are in contact with the child welfare system. Black people are now 41% more likely to get a higher education. Most in a recent survey, when people from Black communities were asked what they thought their life perspective were and how they felt about it, 85% said they could see their life will improve and they will get more opportunities in the near future, in the next 5 years actually. And Black communities are growing communities, and soon in 2023, that was the projection, we will make up about 5% of the Canadian population, which is pretty damn cool. So what to do next? When you hear all this, I hope you understand why I was so passionate about adoption and what it's the reflections that could be done and made around adoption. But what can you do? You could, and I invite you, especially on Family Day, you should acknowledge and celebrate other family structure. You should definitely celebrate family diversity and try to open your mind and try to learn a bit more about why we do family differently and why family can look different. And when you see someone and you hear someone like me when I was a child that says that was trying to talk about my family and was only received by, what? That's not possible. Oh, why did your grandmother abandon your aunt? That was harsh. Honestly, hearing this was very difficult for me because I never seen it that way. And I was a little heartbroken that day. I kind of remember it quite vividly. And so no, my grandmother didn't abandon my aunt. She actually decided to grow our community in a different way, and that was beautiful. And so please celebrate all families. And when you hear something, just ask questions, be inquisitive, learn, educate yourself, and continue learning about Canadian history. There's a lot you don't know. There's more to know for sure. I just talked to you a little bit about the history of Black adoption in Canada, but there's so much more to know and so much more to discover. You will only be a better human when you learn the history of where you live and who you are and where you come from. Be intentionally a good ally to marginalized community. There's many different ways to become a good ally, but there's the best way still to open your ears and to open your heart and listen and uplift voices that can be heard, because we all have a voice, but it depends on who can be heard and who's speaking the loudest. So amplify voices, be a good ally. And also support diversity, equity, inclusion efforts. It's happening more and more. And some people sometimes question it. And it's good to ask questions, but also see the sides of where it's needed. Because if you want to change something, if you want to change the reality that you think is unfair, there's no better way to start than trying to support people that are trying to make a change. I will share some resources. Those are two of my favorite books, Policing Black Lives by Robin Menard. It's an excellent book. You should absolutely read it. The Skin We're In by Desmond Cole, also always on my bedside. Absolutely extraordinary. Docu-series to watch. Please watch Being Black in Canada. You will learn a lot. But soon, Black Life Canadian History will be released, and that should be very interesting, and you should learn tons. Podcast I will advise you to listen. Out of the Sun is it's a book, but it was also made into a podcast. It's about heart, culture, and oppression, and how we see it. It's really good. It's a little bit more original, that classic podcast. And The Secret Life of Canada. You will learn a lot about the history of Canada, about Black communities, but also about a lot other communities that you might know of. Thank you for listening. I hope you have questions and comments, and I hope you'll learn a lot with me. Again, you will see it on my face. Adoption is a passion of mine, and I think you can learn a lot about a society with how they do adoption. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Elise. I have been trying to keep up with the comments. Everyone is just blown away with your passion and all of the information that you have shared. So thank you so much. I am appreciative of the time, but we do have a couple of questions. I wonder if I can maybe ask one. I do apologize. I'm going to be looking down. I am not very good at multitasking.
Okay.
So when you were speaking about the face of adoption for Black children in sort of the 30s and 40s era, someone did ask, and I don't know if you know this answer, but I'm going to ask anyways. What happened to Black children once they became older teens? Were they kicked out of care?
So there is archives that describe what happened, not to all Black children, unfortunately, because like you said, when you're considered kind of a non-human, it's hard to keep track of you, really. What happened, I didn't describe the history, and it's a very interesting question, is that when I said that the system was segregated at first, is that those institutions first started for white children when we weren't sure. So really before that, Black children were just turned away. And like archives showed that they were left out to die, like they were just homeless and they would just wander around. And when institutions were created first, it was because the Black community pushed for those institutions. So some of them were connected to the Black community. And so some children were able to find a sense of balance and stability, but there was not a majority of them. When bigger institutions were created, it's because it was becoming a problem, because they were taking away in such large numbers that you had to do something. And there is not really an age out system. This is not where like you 18. It was really, really like, can you bear living there? Can you stay there really? It was not a suitable environment. So whenever they could, Black children will leave and they will just wander. Like you can imagine that they were just alone and homeless and without their family or community. Some of them were probably able to find their families, but most of them were just, yeah, homeless.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. We did also have a question about some of the findings in One Vision, One Voice. So I do just want to encourage you all to please honestly take a moment to read through it. It's a large document because there's a lot of information that we need to learn about. So I do believe it was posted in the comments on this Facebook Live. So I do encourage everyone to read it, and you can read some of the past ones as well, because I know there have been a couple of additions, and they're forever doing research on this. So please feel free to, for everyone watching, to read, and to obviously the resources as well that you shared, Elise. I feel like I'm processing a lot, and you know, we talk about these like aha moments that people get. Like I feel like this was an entire hour of aha to me, and I just want to thank you so much for your time and your effort and your passion. Again, I know I personally learned a lot, and I just know the same can be said for so many who've watched the videos in this webinar. And I hope you all can take a chance to read back on some of the comments as well, because there's a lot of thanks for you, Elise. So I'm going to wrap things up for all of us, because I do want to be mindful of our time. So on behalf of all of us here at Adopt for Life, I do want to thank you all for joining us, you know, as we continue to learn and grow together. For those of you who may be interested in joining our community for free, please go to www.adoptforlife.com, and we truly are stronger together. Thank you and have a great night.
Have a great night.